Good morning. That's on. Good morning, all. Nice to see you this morning. Welcome to the State Water Board, to our workshop to discuss options for drought-related diversion curtailments of post-1914 water rights within the Delta Watershed. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Water Resources Control Board. With me today are Vice Chair Fran Spivey Weber and board members Tam Dodak, Stephen Moore, and Dee Dee Diadama. Also present are Les Grober, Assistant Deputy Director for Water Rights, Diane Riddle, Environmental Program Manager, Dana Heinrich, and Mariana Aoi, Staff Counsel, and Rich Satkowski, Staff Engineer. You're an engineer. Interesting. Let me just a few things. Many of you know the basics, but indulge me for those of you who do not. Evacuation procedures. If you hear a noise that sounds like an emergency noise, it probably is, and or it's the guy next to your cell phone and elbow him in the ribs. But just go ahead and look for the exits near you. Take your stuff. Proceed carefully out of the building to the Cesar Chavez Park across the street. If you stay there, you'll find out when it's safe to come back. Also, just a reminder that this is being webcast, so it's important to speak into the microphone. Hard to do. My colleagues will help remind me that I need to do it as well. Also, please set your pagers or cell phones on silent or off, just as a courtesy measure. The workshop is being held in accordance with the third revised board meeting agenda for the May 20th and 21st water board meeting. Written comments were accepted until 5 o'clock on Monday. This is an informal meeting. We're not going to take formal action today, and there won't be sworn testimony or cross-examination of participants. The state board and its staff, however, may ask clarifying questions, and we may give direction to staff. It says there's no court reporter present today, but there is. And the reason is that we did not finish our item number 12 yesterday. We continued it to today. And so there's a bit of what staff has called a ping pong of the day, because we're trying to deal with the schedules of some of our colleagues, in particular from some of the fish agencies this morning. I may ask them if they can come back later this afternoon, but what we are going to do is begin with a presentation from staff on possible options for curtailments in the Delta watershed. Some folks informally have asked, are we going to do curtailments? And yes, of course we are. That is part of our mission, our job, and our obligation under the water code. The question is how. And so then we will hear a panel presentation from the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of Water Resources, and the Bureau of Reclamation on the importance of reservoir storage levels to fisheries, as well as the current hydrology and storage conditions in the Delta watershed. Finally, we'll move to comments from the public. If you do intend to speak today, please fill out a blue speaker card and give it to our staff. If you're not sure, just fill out a card and say, if necessary, and we'll ask you when your name comes up. In order to ensure that all participants have an opportunity to participate, comments might be limited to 5 minutes per speaker. It just really depends on how many cards we get. And to avoid repetition in the interest of time, if there are groups of you with the same comment, I actually encourage you to pick a spokesperson to present your comments, but you can stand with them or however to indicate that you agree with that speaker. We will be asking questions. Now, in the ping pong, what we're going to do is we're going to hear the presentation on 13, and then we're going to move back to item 12 from yesterday. I am presuming that those of you who are here for 13 who weren't here yesterday will actually be interested in 12, so I encourage you, your listening and participation there, and then we'll decide whether we're going to be able to act on 12 and give direction, whether we want to come back to it a little later in the day. But we're going to do the presentations or the re-presentations first this morning to take advantage of having particularly our other agency colleagues with us. So bear with us on that. And our other agency colleagues, who I know have to leave by 10, if you're able to send representatives that come back later in the day, please let us know that, because obviously we do our best work if we can hear from everybody and can go back and ask you questions that may not be front of mind this morning, but which come up through the discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Diane and Rich, right, to get going.
Good morning. Again, I'm Diane Riddle. I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the Hearings in Bay Delta section. Rich and I are going to start with an overview, some background on why we're proposing these potential curtailment options and potential options for doing so. Then we'll hear from the panel with the fish agencies and the Department of Water Resources and Bureau of Reclamation. I'm going to request that questions on the presentation be held until after the fish agencies and projects are able to come up and speak so that they can get out of here on time. Do I have a PowerPoint? Okay. I can probably move forward and okay, here we go. So as you're aware, the purpose of this workshop is to discuss options for drought-related curtailments of post-1914 water rights in the Delta watershed. Along with the agenda for the board meeting yesterday, we released a fact sheet with 4 potential options and questions related to those options and questions about whether there were further options that the board should be considering. As you're aware, and you've heard a lot about for the last several months, California is in the 3rd year of a drought, which has reduced stream flows and storage conditions in the Delta watershed and other areas of the state. Based on these conditions, the Department and Bureau of Reclamation requested temporary urgency modifications to their water right requirements to meet Delta outflows and other measures in the Delta. The executive director conditionally approved those modifications over the past several months. Related to those modifications, the Department and Bureau developed a drought operations plan that lays out their plans for operations through the remainder of the water year, which included minimum storage levels moving into next year. However, while DWR and the Bureau plan to meet that drought operations plan, there are concerns over whether they'll be able to do so due to depletions in the system, because DWR and the Bureau do not have complete control over all of those depletions, including illegal diversions of the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation's previously stored water that they released to meet Delta requirements. As you heard yesterday, this year we're expecting there will be inadequate natural stream flows to meet most post-1914 diversions in the Delta watershed. As a result, there's concerns that large amounts of previously stored water by the projects will be illegally diverted by other users, resulting in increased depletions and the need for increased project releases to offset those depletions, which could lead to decreases in storage levels and concerns over the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation's ability to provide minimum storage levels needed for repelling salinity in the Delta, meeting minimum health and safety needs, and meeting fishery-related needs for cold water. As a result, staff has put together some options for potential curtailments of water diversions needed to protect previously stored water and potentially contribute to Delta outflow requirements and other requirements. So with that, I'll turn it over to Rich to go over the options and provide a little more background.
Good morning. I'm Rich Zukowski with the Division of Water Rights. In the Delta watershed, there are many post-1914 water rights. There's about 8,700 total water rights in the Delta watershed. About 5,800 of those are permits and licenses, and those have been issued for various beneficial uses, including municipal, industrial, agricultural, fish and wildlife, power, recreation, and there's many more. I wanted to mention that of those 5,800 permits and licenses, about 2,300 of those, or about 40%, have water rights that have less than 10 acre-feet of face value. Face value essentially is the maximum amount of water that could be used under that particular water right. There's also a group of water users that we call the small user diverters. There's about 2,900 of those, and their use is less than or equal to 10 acre-feet. And those are the small domestic registrations, the livestock stock ponds, and the ones in those categories.
So that's in addition to the 2,300?
Yes.
That's 23 plus 29.
It's
A little.
yeah, so it's 5,800 permits and licenses, and yeah, it's in addition to the 2,300 small permits and licenses that are less than 10 acre-feet.
But the 2,900, is that overlap the 23, or that's in addition to the 23?
That's in addition.
Okay.
So yesterday, the Delta Water Master had reported that he had sent out notices on May 13th to all, not all Term 91s, but 93, what we call the Term 91 water right holders within the Delta Watershed. And those notices stated that those folks that have water right Term 91 would need to curtail their water use beginning May 20th, which is yesterday. Also yesterday, Mr. O'Hagan, John O'Hagan, had mentioned that for other water rights in the Delta Watershed, there were pending curtailments of water rights, water diversions, and he had mentioned that between May 15th and June 1st, that based on the supply and demand curves and estimates that he had, that it appears that all post-1914 water users would be curtailed. Also, he may not have mentioned it yesterday, but on his website, he mentioned that because all post-14s would be curtailed, it also looks like between June 1st and June 15th, excuse me, junior pre-1914 water right holders would be curtailed. And then sometime after June 16th, more senior, what we call pre-1914 water right holders would be curtailed, and it may even, the water supply situation may even get so dire that there would be some need to have some reduction in use by the riparian water users. And if that were to happen, then that use would be, or that diversion would be reduced on a correlative basis. So they'd all have to share in any need to reduce water. Mr. O'Hagan also mentioned that in the tributaries to the Delta, there's also various streams that are subject to stream-based curtailments in the spring and summer. So I mentioned water right term 91. Water right term 91 is a water right term that essentially protects the project stored water releases that are being released to meet Delta requirements. And in the water right term 91 conceptual model, if you will, it treats the Delta watershed as an interconnected basin. So it's one big bathtub, so to speak. What it does, it specifically prohibits diversions when natural and abandoned flows are insufficient to meet Delta requirements. And there's two criteria that need to be in place to impose the Term 91 requirements. The first one is when the Delta is declared to be in balance by the water projects. And the second is when stored project water is being released to meet Delta requirements and in-basin entitlements. Now, I wanted to point out that there's limited applicability of those water right users that would need to be curtailed in the Term 91, and that's because it only affects 121 larger water users with a water right priority of about 1965 or later in the Delta watershed. It also only includes those that have some sort of hydraulic continuity with the delta, connectivity with the delta. And as far as larger, that means that it's only for those water right holders that are in the 100 acre foot or acre foot per year or more usage, and that sort of category.
I have just a question, but it's only those users because it was included in their water rights when they obtained their water right. It's included as a condition.
That's correct. This is a picture of California showing the Delta watershed, and on here are the dots are the Term 91 permits and licenses, and as I mentioned, there's 121 of those, and they're spread throughout the watershed in the Sacramento side of the watershed and in the San Joaquin side of the watershed. Some are directly along the Sacramento River and San Joaquin rivers. Other are on tributaries to those rivers. And here's a similar picture, but this is all post 1914 appropriative water rights in the Delta watershed. So there's about 5,800 of them, and as you can see, they're very spread out. And then just for context, here's a picture of the small use diverters. Those are that last category that have face values less than 10 acre feet. So these are not permits and licenses that have some sort of use less than 10 acre feet. It's only those other water users, and so there's about 2,900 of those. Recently, the legislature enacted a law, and in the water code now, we have Water Code Section 1058, which essentially says that in critically dry years, immediately preceded by 2 or more consecutive below normal or drier years, or when the governor has issued a proclamation of a state of emergency based on a drought. So this applies only in those conditions. I believe yesterday somebody had mentioned that, or was implying that this water code section would not be in place because one of the 2 years preceding this year was a below normal year, but this provision actually mentions below normal years. It also allows for adoption of emergency regulations to require curtailments, and it increases the penalties for violations. So as Diane had mentioned earlier, we have essentially 4 curtailment options, and the first one is using our existing authorities, the board's existing authorities to curtail, and this would be using reported use data. And I should preface that by saying I'll briefly go through each of these 4. The second one is using some sort of emergency regulations to and using also the reported use data that water right holders report to the state board. The third one is using emergency regulation using a Term 91 approach, and it should say that in this approach the outflow is we call backstopped by the projects. And the fourth one is similar to the third one. It's using emergency regulation, using Term 91 approach, but with Delta requirements met entirely by the water project, the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. Oops. Now, with all these alternatives, there are possible curtailments that could occur. Curtailment exceptions, I should say, excuse me. The first one is if there is no hydraulic continuity with the delta, And we say that in the absence of the diversions. The second is some sort of exception for minimum municipal and domestic use. Also for run-of-the-river power type uses, where the system essentially is a flow-through system and there's no water being diverted as part of the power generating through the system. And also for some other critical water needs, and this would be on a case-by-case basis for such things like as sanitation, fire needs, dust suppression, energy plant cooling, actually for grid reliability, other imminent public health or safety threats that are identified by the public health agencies. And also, there could be some exceptions if there are some local cooperative solutions that are proposed. So under option 1, this is the existing authorities using reported data, use data. It essentially uses the full natural flow from the Department of Water Resources and the historic reported diversion data over the recent past, over the past few years. And essentially you have supply and you have an estimated demand, and those can be compared, and that's what Mr. O'Hagan was describing yesterday. It should wanted to note that the reported diversions have been corrected or are being corrected for known errors that that show up. There's sometimes there's double reporting by the water user, that sort of thing. And so if that's the case, they, as part of their looking at the diversion numbers, will correct for that. And I wanted to point out that also that the reported diversions are not real-time values. They're based on the diversions over the recent past, but they're not current 2014 diversions. Under option 1, the curtailment is based on water right priorities. There would be some bypass for senior water rights, downstream senior water rights, and for storage water releases. It does not require others in the system besides the water projects to contribute to delta outflow requirements, delta requirements. And there's no specific exception to the water right priorities, such as having an exception for minimum health and safety needs or something like that. But the board could use its enforcement discretion in deciding whether to take some sort of enforcement action. Option 2 is similar to option 1, except that it relies on the authority under Water Code section 1058.5 and requires curtailment when the natural flows are inadequate to support the priority of right needed for critical health and safety or other needs. So this would have specific provision in the emergency regulations to deal with health and safety and other critical water needs. It would be in effect for 270 days, and after the 270-day period, it may be renewed for a certain period of time. This option, because it uses emergency regulations, is more streamlined and provides a more effective enforcement mechanism, we believe. We will, through this sort of mechanism, we can enforce based on a violation of the regulation, and violations would be immediately enforceable. There could be a administrative civil liability or an ACL, as is commonly known, of $500 per day, or the board could issue a cease and desist order. It would also, if the board issued a cease and desist order and somebody were there to then take water that, while the cease and desist order is in place, there could be fines of up to $10,000 per day for the violation.
And that's the authority we were explicitly given in the
Yes.
emergency regulation.
So option 3 is using the emergency regulations approach and using a Term 91 type of methodology. It's the same as option 2, but we would be essentially using real-time information to do a Term 91-like calculation to determine when essentially surplus water is not available in the Delta watershed system. To do this, though, it would require some sort of modification to the Term 91 equation to account for in-basin contract deliveries. It would protect natural flows and storage releases needed to meet the Delta water requirements, and in doing so would reduce the need for project storage releases, but it would increase the effects on other diverters in the system. And again, the projects would continue to backstop the flow requirements. So if it's estimated that a certain amount of water is water's being released and not enough water is in the system for some reason, the projects would definitely have to make sure there was enough flow to backstop and meet any sort of delta flow requirements. And then we have option 4, which is the emergency regulations using a Term 91 approach again, but with the outflow requirements met by the project. So it's the same as option 3, except that the water users would only be curtailed when the natural and abandoned flows are not available to meet the water right priority, given that there are more senior needs in the system. The Delta requirements would be the responsibility of the water project, with the exception of existing Term 91 water rights, because that term is already in the permits and licenses of those 121 water users. Other water users would not be required to curtail diversions of natural abandoned flows to meet Delta requirements, and this would have less benefit to the project storage levels and less impact to other water diverters. And so, sort of in summary, we have option 1 that does not require any kind of emergency regulation. The curtailment notices that would be sent out are not enforceable orders. There could be would be a need for further investigations of some sort of illegal use of water, or water that's being diverted while there is a notice stating that there is not water under that particular water right, and there could be case-specific findings that could be required for a cease and desist order or at ACL. The penalties are $1,000 per day and $2,500 per acre foot. Diverters may request a hearing and, of course, challenge any sort of determination of the unavailability of the water. And this method, or this option, would require significant staffing resources to go through the process of investigating what might be illegal diversion of water, and of course writing it up and going through the hearing process. And then options 2, 3, and 4 require sort of an emergency regulation. They're streamlined and have more effective enforcement mechanisms. That's because the enforceable orders could be issued immediately. We can then enforce based on the violation of the regulation. There's additional penalties, which I mentioned earlier, that could be very significant, and it could specify exceptions for certain criteria, such as minimum health and safety needs or other critical water needs. So in the notice, the agenda item for this workshop, there were 6 questions that were spelled out. So The 6 questions are, real briefly, which curtailment options would be the most effective and enforceable? Are there any other curtailment options that should be considered? How can human health and safety needs be addressed under the various approaches to curtailments? How can the board ensure that Delta needs will be met, the needs of fish and wildlife, and to maintain adequate end-of-month storage levels in, of course, upstream reservoirs? And then finally, number 5, how can voluntary water sharing agreements be accommodated? What criteria should be used to determine whether these agreements are viable alternatives to the mandatory curtailments? And which curtailment option would be the most responsive to changing conditions? And that's the end of our presentation.
So again, we're going to turn it over to the Department of Water Resources, the Bureau of Reclamation, the fish agencies to make some remarks.
Good morning. I don't have an order in front of me, so I'll leave it to you all to self-organize.
Good morning, Chairman Marcus. I'm Paul Fujitani with the Bureau of Reclamation. Okay, I'm Paul Fujitani with the Bureau of Reclamation, and John Leahy with the Department of Water Resources and I have prepared an integrated presentation for you on kind of a summary of the State Water Project and CVP reservoir and operational status over the past month or two, and it'll provide some insight on some of the accretion depletions within the Central Valley in that time period.
Great. Modeling good behavior of collaboration.
So, and John and I would be jumping back and forth between us, as we go through the slides.
Okay, yes, good morning, Chair Marcus and other board members. At the risk of being repetitive, I'm going to start this one off where we left off. Feels like just a couple weeks ago. As a matter of fact, it was the same panel here. What we described here was the historical 8-station precip for the Northern Sierra, and we discussed how early in the year we were really looking at an outlier type year, catastrophic in nature, well below the 77-24 precip. And we did receive that recovery. Still a very, very bad dry year, but not at the catastrophic point. Oops. I want to just again review the drought operations plan objectives, that the plan that we did put together as part of both for ESA purposes and for amendment to our petition back from January as far as modification of D1641 standards. So the principles that we were looking at in that plan were protection of the health and safety supplies, delta salinity control, and cold water pool. As things improved somewhat, we are in much better shape, we feel, as far as, well, we can meet our health and safety needs, project needs for this year, and at least latest projections show that we should be able to meet those in 2015 as well, based on our projections. Delta salinity control, as you know, we had been considering delta emergency barriers. Conditions didn't improve, but we certainly are continuing to plan for those based on the carryover storages that we are looking at for the end of this year. We would not be well positioned for next year if we had a repeat of similar type hydrology. Cold water pool, this year marginal at best, and certainly, again, not well positioned going into next year. So that explains why we continued to, although we scaled back the number of modifications that we were requesting under D1641, we still have some requested modifications to help with that end of year storage. So going back to the storages, this was a similar graphic that I provided 2 weeks ago, and the dark blue, if you recall, is kind of the average storages, combined storages I have for Shasta, Oroville, Folsom, and the typical pattern, which really drives the system, is the capture of the direct runoff and snowmelt in the winter and spring periods. You can see, again, the dark blue. And in fact, May or June is typically where we'll top out in reservoir storage, at which point we begin releasing that storage to meet in-basin uses as the system dries out through the summer and into the fall. So really that's what allows the system to control the salinity in the delta, and so it extremely important that this is the way things work. What we have here is the forecast from January in the light blue. That was the actual storage this year for January. And the forecast at that time, if you recall, was the very dire picture, and it showed no increase in storage from January to April, which was bringing us to the conclusion that that storage would not be available for the salinity control. And that's why we were moving forward on potential delta barriers for salinity control and a significant amount of modification requests for the D1641 standards. You can see the end of September storage there, very low in that scenario. April, after the improvements in February and March, you do see that the actual storage came in significantly higher than what those earlier projections had been for the end of April, still lagging significantly behind the average year. Our projections, again, they're in the green for end of September, improved greatly, close to doubling what we had been forecasting back in January, but still, as you can also see, less than half of what we would typically have for end of September storage for the projects. We have now a new data point here where we have preliminary results now based on conditions as of May 1st. We have run our typical forecast models, and as you can see, right now the forecast for September is slipped just a bit on that storage. So although we saw February and March well above average precipitation, April was well below average, so it did have an effect on our latest forecasts. We're actually showing lower forecasted end of September storage than we did last month. And now I'll hand it off back to Paul.
For the next few slides, I'll just step through our major storage reservoirs and just provide an update on what we've seen in those reservoirs as far as inflow, releases, and storage. Starting out up north with Shasta Reservoir, The upper line there, kind of bending over, is the storage at Shasta. It peaked on about April 28th. The two other jagged lines there represent the blue, darker blue one is the inflow to Shasta, and the greenish line there would be the flow at Wilkins Slough. You can see with the inflow the couple storms we did see in March and April, and the spikes in the Wilkins Slough flow with the unimpaired, unregulated flow entering the Central Valley. The line across the bottom of the graph there is our Keswick release. So through most of March and April, we were right around 3250 or so, trying to conserve as much water as we could. And just recently, we began increasing releases to support the increase in demands within the Central Valley. Right around the end of April, we had to boost our releases out of Keswick to about 7,500, where we're currently at now. And that's about the same time that we saw the storage in Shasta bend over, and we're now in the storage withdrawal mode. Something other than, I think, noteworthy in the tail end of the slide here is that the flow at Wilkins Slough is now less than what we're seeing for our releases at Keswick. That crossover changed right around that same period, end of April, 1st of May, and that's when our storage withdrawals are meeting the in-basin demands between Keswick and Wilkins Slough. Oh, I showed Oroville on here too. I don't know if, John, you want to hit it. It's basically the same few parameters. But
Yeah, it's basically the same pattern. As Paul had indicated, the system is turning around now. As of a couple weeks ago, we started drafting storage from Oroville. What's not shown on here, we have releases to the river increasing, but we also have diversions directly out of the Oroville complex, meeting some of the in-basin uses. And so same pattern as Shasta, basically.
moving on through with Folsom Reservoir, again, the upper black line is storage. What did get cut off the tail end here, that this slide only goes through May 15th. In the past few days, we did see the releases from Folsom Reservoir exceed the inflow, and so we are now withdrawing water from storage reservoir. Also, we've peaked storage there just within the past couple days. We're on the downward side. But again, the upper line is the storage, blue line inflow, and the bottom line are releases out of Lake Natoma. And one thing I did not show on the slide either is we do have some other diversions to the city of Folsom, Roseville, through the Folsom South Canal and Folsom pumping plant. They're fairly small compared to the others. The other CVP reservoir that we've got in our operations in the Central Valley, it's not hydrologically integrated with our other CVP and State Water Project operations, is New Melones. You can see that with New Melones, it peaked storage actually on about March 11th. And that is when we had to increase releases out of New Melones to meet the Vanellis salinity standard. The releases are shown on the lower of the lines there along the bottom of the chart. Another noteworthy item from this chart would be the pulse flow that we released from New Melones beginning on, I'd say it's about like the 13th of April. It was for the April 17th to May 17th pulse flow period. We went up to a release of about 2,500 CFS out of New Melones, out of Goodwin to the Stanislaus River, and cut to about 2,100 for the last bench there. Our releases are now 600. We're cutting to about 500 out of Goodwin, and we'll be ramping down further as we can to, or as we have to meet the 500 CFS Vanellis requirement for the end of May, and also we are closely watching the Vanellis salinity. An interesting point on this chart here is the Vanellis flow. That's the light green line that actually bumps up above the storage there, as shown on the chart here. But as you can see on the table, there is not a lot of extra flow in the San Joaquin River outside of releases from Goodwin. In fact, as we got towards the end of the pulse flow period, our releases from Goodwin were about 2,100 CFS, and we were seeing about 2,200 at Vernalis on the San Joaquin River. On this chart, we're showing basically some of the water balance within the Sacramento Valley as compared to what we're releasing out of our reservoir and what we're seeing at Freeport. So the bottom lines on the chart are the releases from Oroville, Folsom, and Keswick, and the upper line is the flow that was observed at Freeport. So again, we have the unimpaired flow hitting the system from the storms we had in March and April. And then right around the first part of May, the lines, well, if you can mentally sum up the lines from our releases out of our reservoirs and the lines at Freeport there, our releases are not all reaching the Freeport values. Our depletions are exceeding our releases.
Okay, this next slide is sort of a schematic to try to help describe the situation that we're now just transitioning to with projects, storage withdrawals being used to meet in-basin uses. So just to briefly go through this, the light blue arrows depicted on here represent the unstored flow into the system. So this would be inflows upstream into the major reservoirs. This would also be flows entering downstream of the major reservoirs, including the Yuba River, for example, San Joaquin River. So the situation we were in February, March was essentially the light blue or unstored flows was more than enough to meet all of the in-basin uses, and in fact the projects were storing, as you saw from some of those graphs, a great deal of this water for later use, for use during this period starting now. And the light blue lines downstream of the reservoir there was plenty of flow to meet all of for the most part, the in-basin uses as well. So those in-basin uses are depicted in green on here, which would be all of the diversions, some of those directly out of the lake, Lake Oroville. As I said, the Lake Oroville complex, through Thermalito, we provide deliveries out of Folsom Lake. Deliveries are provided directly. Those in-basin uses are also diversions in the delta. It's also any outflow requirements or salinity requirements under D1641. So those are all part of the in-basin uses in the system. And then we have the exports shown there also, Banks and Tracy. So now the bar graphs on the far left now represents what we have just transitioned to here in May. We're a little bit earlier than typical. It varies from year to year though. Where we're in a condition now where the amount of unstored flow in the system is not enough to meet all of the in-basin uses. So the blue bar is much less than what the in-basin use requirements are. So the projects are now releasing storage that previously stored this last winter and spring to make up the difference between the unstored flow and the in-basin uses. So that's the condition we're in, and we're also withdrawing storage to meet any export demand as well. The one thing, because we have concern with that project storage, we have reduced our exports to less than a tenth of what we would typically be starting to export during the summer months. So we're at 1,000 CFS, essentially combined export, as we sit here today. So we're trying to work with the limited project storage withdrawals that we have. This graph here shows where the system has flipped here within the last couple weeks, And a lot of this is directly related to Term 91 going into place as of yesterday. But so what's shown here is, okay, again, the exports are the dark line, positive CFS. The storage withdrawals, total storage withdrawals would be the blue line there. And so it's negative storage withdrawal because we were actually storing water still in April and into right about the first part of May. And you can see just prior to May 5th, we got to the point where we were starting to release some of that storage. And first, there was plenty of other unstored water to meet the in-basin uses, but we were releasing a little bit of water to meet those minimum exports. As things continue to dry out in the system, we are now at the point where we are releasing storage for the exports plus all of the other in-basin uses. So that would include, for example, the outflow requirement of under the TUCP. The requirement is 3,000, so 3,000 CFS, and you can see though that these in-basin uses are continuing to increase, and in fact, we wouldn't expect them to really top out until we get into June, July, which, you know, well, once we get into June, certainly, that's where we would typically start to see the peak of in-basin uses in the system. And so that, we expect that pattern to just continue. I think that's all we had for the formal presentation. So hopefully this information is